Hello, everybody. How are you? Good. It's so good to be here. I said this in the first service. Before yesterday, I had hit 45 states, and I had never been to Kansas. And so this morning, have hit 46 states. Yes. No, it's awesome. It's cool. It's great to be here. It's great to be with all of you. In a lot of ways, I feel like, because I've gotten to know you guys for a couple of years now, it feels like kind of the culmination for me of like, wow, I get to just be with all of you and to learn from all of you, and just to get to preach is it's truly a privilege. And so I would love, if I can I show you a picture of my family? Yeah? I would have done that without your permission anyway, but whatever. I do appreciate the permission, but this is them. I know, right? I know. So this is my family, and they are just, gosh, they're my pride and joy. I travel a lot and do a lot of speaking, and I try to travel with my family as much as possible, but when I don't get the chance to do it, I just miss them tremendously. And so on the left here, this picture is about a year old, so it's not very current, but on the left is Isaiah. He's 8 years old. He's in 3rd grade. My wife, Megan, is there, and we've been married for 12 years. We hit double digits. We totally are veterans. We know exactly. I have no idea what I'm doing as a husband or a dad most days. I have no clue. We're just trying to figure it out. And then on my lap is Silas. He is 4. Silas just started preschool last week, and he told his teachers his first day. He gets through his first day, and then the second day, he tells his teacher when he walks in, he's like, I don't think I'm ready for school to start yet. She was like, okay. And he's like, I'll tell you when I'm ready for school to start. 60 minutes later, an hour later, he was like, okay, I'm ready for the day to start. I'm ready for school to start. I was like, Silas lives in his own little world. So anyway, this is another picture of them. They're just, gosh, they're amazing. The backstory for us with our family is that my wife and I, we got married, and my wife is like, I just want to be a mom. Like, that's just what I want to do. Like, my calling on the planet is to be a mom. That's all I want. And so we got married, and then we're told that we couldn't have our own biological children, and it was just crushing. Like, it was devastating. And I don't know if any of you have dealt with infertility in here and kind of walked that journey, but it's hard and stuff. But the beautiful thing about what we walked through with infertility is that we realized that God actually wanted to grow our family in a very particular way. And while we didn't see it at first, we realized that God had a way better plan. And so my wife and I have had the privilege to adopt both of our kids from birth. And it has been such a gift. We're actually in the adoption process a 3rd time. And so we've just had them since birth. They're domestic infant adoptions. And so a lot of people are like, what country did you adopt from? And we're from like the indigenous land of Lansing, Michigan. And Grand Rapids, Michigan, which, some people are like expecting Ethiopia or something like that. And we're like, Michigan, which does feel like its own land sometimes. But nonetheless, they're open adoptions. We have relationships with 3 of 4 birth parents. So Isaiah, we have a relationship with his birth mom and his birth dad, and for Silas, his birth mom, we have a relationship with. When we were adopting Isaiah, we were in the hospital when his birth mom, Lindsay, was in labor, and she ended up, after 30 hours of being in labor, ended up having an emergency C-section. And so her mom, her name is Jane, was with Lindsay, and so they brought her into the operating room, and my wife and I were like, totally like, go, like, we're praying for you and stuff. And so we hung back, and while we were waiting in our room, a nurse came by who was kind of in the flurry of everything and threw my wife a pair of scrubs and said, put these on, come in with the nurses, and don't make eye contact with the doctor. And so my wife got snuck into the operating room and was there when Isaiah was born. And what was really beautiful is that the nurse cleaned him up and then handed him to my wife as if she was a nurse taking care of him. But so we've had him from birth, and then we were at the hospital when Silas was born. We saw him about 45 minutes later. And the backstory there is that Silas's birth mom, her name is Rosie. She was adopted from Brazil. She was actually a student in the youth group where I was the youth pastor for many years at a church. She was 21 when she had Silas, and so it was a few years later, and she was looking through profile books to put together an adoption plan, and she saw our profile book, and she's like, that guy used to be my pastor. And so she was going to have a closed adoption, wasn't going to have a relationship with the adopted family, and decided at the very last minute to choose us. And it's just been such a privilege. And for us, like, what's been really neat is that adoption is not plan B for us. It's not like it's the next best thing. Like, adoption has been and will be all along plan A for our family. It is the thing that we feel called to do, and so we are just so called to adopt. We're so called in particular to open adoption, and it's just so important for us. So that's a little bit of my family, and part of the reason why I tell you this is because I don't know about you. I'm just going to ask the dads in here for just a second. I don't know about you, but since I've become a parent, I have become a weeping, sobbing mess of a human being. Like, I'm kind of an emotional disaster, all right? And so are there any other just men for a moment? Are there any other men who would just like admit to this? 1, 2, 3, 5 of us. There's 5 of us in here. Would you lead a therapy session for us after this service? So I think you've got like a recovery group in play that you could, we need your help. I am like an emotional disaster. I cry all the time. It's ridiculous. I've cried when our kids have said their first words. I've cried when they've taken their first steps. I've cried watching them sleep, which sounds way creepier than I mean it to be. I mean it. I cried watching Toy Story 4 the other day. Like, I'm just a mess. And so here's the deal. You don't know me. But if I cry at any point during this sermon, can you just let me have my moment? Is that good? The likelihood of it is pretty high. And like, I got through first service, thankfully, without crying. But like, I'll get through it. It'll be fine. Like, just let me have my moment. Does that sound good? Perfect. So that is my family. They are amazing. I work for an organization called the Fuller Youth Institute. We are a research center at Fuller Theological Seminary that's based out of Pasadena, California. I work at an office in Grand Rapids, Michigan with a few other people. But we are a research center at Fuller. Fuller Theological Seminary is the largest non-denominational seminary in the world, and we do research. We are self-proclaimed research nerds. We love research. And so what we do is we take really well done research and we turn that into resources for the church. So the majority of our staff at the Fuller Youth Institute have also worked in the church, just on a very practical level. And so we do this research and we are deeply, deeply committed to it. And so that's a little bit of what we do, a little bit of how we've gotten connected with Connect Church. I bet that happens all the time, doesn't it? It's great. But that's how we formed a relationship, and they went through one of our research projects. I want to read a passage, though, before we get into a little bit of the research, and it's from Acts 20, and the full passage is Acts 27 through 12. We're just going to read through verse 9 for right now. But it's the story. What's happening in Acts is that the book of the early church is growing like crazy. It's spreading, and Paul is traveling all over the place as he's trying to build up the disciples, or basically disciples, to carry the message of Jesus on. And so he's traveling right here, and this is what happens, verse 7 of chapter 20 in the book of Acts. It says, "On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight." That is not going to happen today. Okay? Just give you that warning. He kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room while we were meeting, which I think for the writer, for Luke, he's probably like, the reason why I'm mentioning the lamps is because there was oil in the lamps, and he's probably like, Paul talked for so long that I needed to keep on replacing the oil in the lamps, because otherwise, why would you mention that there were lamps in the room? I think he's probably like, he just talked for so long, right? And so there were many lamps in the upstairs room we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. Just get the picture of youth ministry with a bunch of students in the room and someone preaching on and on and on. And this is Eutychus right now. Eutychus is like the student in youth ministry who cannot stay awake, right? And so Eutychus, he's seated in this window. He's falling into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. And when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. That story escalates so quickly. Like, there isn't even a sentence of transition in there, right? All of a sudden, he's just dead. He just falls down. And we're going to stop there for just a moment because I was thinking, like, you don't know me. I'm covered in tattoos, and I've got plugs in my ears, so what can I do to win you over? I should probably tell the story of Eutychus dying and falling out the window, right? Like, that would be like, yeah, I mean, you would totally resonate with me, and, like, I want to win you over with that. I asked Nate, I was like, how do you think I should win them over, you know, like with the tattoo? I mean, I still love Jesus. I just want you to know this, okay? I really do love Jesus, even though you might not agree with that. I love Jesus. But I was like, what would be a good way to win them over? He's like, you probably should talk about that kid dying in the book of Acts. So if you get weirded out by this, it's actually Nate's idea, okay? I'm just like, you know, and he said he would take all the blame for it. And he said if anybody was offended or upset about the tattoos, then like, you know, you could go talk to him. So anyway, no. But I was like, you know what? Let's just start there. And the reason why is because what we do at the Fuller Youth Institute, what we're committed to at the Fuller Youth Institute is we are committed to studying young people so that that doesn't happen in the church. And I don't mean that from a literal perspective, okay? I don't mean that like Jamie is preaching and kids fall out the window, okay? But what I am saying is from a spiritual perspective, we at the Fuller Youth Institute exist so that the young people who are in our churches grow up with a robust faith, with a gospel that actually means something to them, something that they can actually take with them for the rest of their lives. And so we at the Fuller Youth Institute are committed, deeply committed to making sure that our young people are not falling asleep spiritually, they are not dying spiritually, and they are instead staying awake and having a vibrant faith that lasts. And so we are a hopeful research organization. And there are some research organizations that are not hopeful. Some research organizations in the church would tell you that the church is ready to fall apart and, you know, there's just no hope. We are a hopeful research organization. We love the church. We believe in the local church. We believe that the local church is the hope for the world. And so we are a solution-oriented research organization that makes research into resources for local churches. Now, at the same time, I say that because Max Deprez, who was a former trustee at Fuller Seminary, he passed away, but he would say that the first job of leaders is to define reality. And so while we are a hopeful research organization, we need to kind of define reality about where we're at with young people and the church. So we did this project for a 5-year project called the College Transition Project. We studied 503 high school seniors who were directly connected in youth groups and churches. These are students who identify as followers of Jesus. So we studied them starting in their senior year of high school and wanted to see what would happen over the course of their college life or their college experience. And what we found is that within about 18 months of a student leaving for college, about 1 in 2 of the students in our youth groups will drift from college. Now, there's some of you who wonder, like, what does that mean? When you say drift or they shelve their faith, or what does that mean? There's a variety of different ways that we looked at that. It's complicated, but we looked at internal beliefs. We looked at external behaviors. We looked at whether or not faith was in process or whether it had stalled. So we weren't just looking and being like, well, that student's not showing up to church services anymore, so they've shelved their faith. It's a deeper part of it. Like, it's a deeper thing. And so what we found was that within that 18-month period, about 1 in 2 of the students in our study, which is one of the largest studies of its kind that was done at the time, would drift from faith. Imagine taking all of your students in their senior year of high school and lining them up on the stage, and every other one just gone, 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 gone. Imagine watching half of your students just say, yeah, I just don't think that I'm going to follow Jesus anymore. I don't know about you, but for us, we would say that that's a failing grade. Here's what else is interesting, is that I'm a little cynical. I'm a little like, I question a lot of things. And I remember as we were wrestling through this, I started asking the question, well, okay, so 1 in 2 students will drift, but what about those students who were raised in the church, but forced to go to church by their mom and their dad, and so finally they leave for college and they're no longer under the grasp of their mom and dad, and are like, sweet, I don't have to attend church anymore. We did a little bit more study. We cross-correlated some different research that had been done, particularly one study from Lifeway, and what we actually found is that out of the 50% of students that were shelving faith or drifting from faith, 4 out of 5 students wanted to stick. So 80% of the 50% of students who left intended to actually stick with faith. Well, that brings out a whole other question, doesn't it? Because the question is no longer those young people leaving, it's their fault. I started asking the question, well, maybe we have not prepared our students well to have a robust faith after they graduated. So we did a little more study, and what we found is that out of these 503 high school seniors, 1 in 7 felt equipped with a faith beyond high school. It's like 15% of the students that we studied felt like they could move and transition faith from high school into college. This is just part of reality defining, right? This is just like, it's depressing, but we have to talk about it. Here's another statistic that's really important. So this is from Pew Research, and what we're finding is that on this side over here, this is the population of the United States that are made up of 18 to 29-year-olds demographic, right? So 17% of our United States population is made up of 18 to 29-year-olds. Over here, what we're finding is that 10% of church attendance is made up of 18 to 29-year-olds. This number here is hanging up pretty steady. This number right here is in decline. So what this is telling us that young people, 18 to 29, are not keeping up with the trajectory of the population in the United States when it comes to church attendance. We're losing ground currently. Like we're regularly, currently losing ground. There's additional research that has been done by Pew. Barna has done some research. We've done some research on this. And that what we're finding is that the religious nuns are on the rise. And when I say this, I do not mean nuns as in N-U-N-S, as in Catholic nuns. That was supposed to be a joke, but nobody thought that was funny. Even though I thought it was funny. Like, I'll laugh about the nun joke. Okay, all right, moving on. That's going real well. You guys know what Catholic nuns are here, right, in Kansas? All right, okay. Oh, I didn't want to assume. I don't know. People are like, just shut up and talk, okay? So we're not talking about N-U-N-S. We're talking about N-O-N-E-S, which is those who claim to have no religious affiliation. Those who are basically like apathetic. These are not people who are resistant to faith. It's just people who are like, yeah, I don't really have any faith affiliation. This study that was done from Pew Research in 2008, 2009 to 2013, the rise of the religious nuns grew from 16 to 23%. I was recently speaking in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and I wanted to do some additional research for Canadian research because this is all done with churches in the United States. And so Pew had done this, they'd done this article called Canada's Changing Religious Landscape. So I started looking into it, and they'd done a bunch of study on the religious nuns. And in the Maritimes, Canada, which is like New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, in the Maritimes, Canada, what they found was that in 1977, 1% of the population identified as a religious nun. And then they did the same study, and they looked, and in 2013, same timeline as this, 25% 4% of the population had identified as religious nun. 1977, religious nuns are like a non-existent population in Canada, in Atlantic Canada. In 2013, 1 out of 4 of the students in Atlantic Canada claim to have no religious affiliation. And what many people believe, what we would believe as researchers here, is that we are about 5 years behind the trajectory of what's happening in Canada. So the United States is just slightly beyond what's happening. Canada is basically labeled as like a post-Christian country at this point. Right? In the same way that the UK or some parts of Europe or like Australia, New Zealand are post-Christian, it's not antagonistic with people. Like people are not antagonistic about faith, they're just apathetic about faith. It's like, well, yeah, I just don't really have any religious affiliation. So this is part of just the reality defining. And I know it's not exciting, it's kind of depressing, but it's tough. But this is something that we are committed to trying to look at. So we started asking the question as a hopeful research organization, what if this isn't the whole story? Like, what if there were actually churches who were reaching and engaging young people well? What if, in our case, there were 15 to 29-year-olds who were deeply connected in specific churches? And could we do research looking at those specific churches and basically see what are those churches doing that are keeping, attracting, retaining young people? And so we did this project called called the Churches Engaging Young People Project, CEYP. We called it KEEP. And it got published as a book called Growing Young. And what we did is, over the course of about 3.5 years, we did 1,300 interviews with 259 churches from across the country. Large churches, like above 20,000 people, small churches, like under 100 people. But we did all different places, like there were urban areas, there were rural areas, but 259 churches. And so what we did was we started with 259, we parsed that down and did 535 phone interviews with 41 churches. A church that I worked at called Frontline Community Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan was part of the 41 churches, so we had about 30 people from the church that I worked at that were part of the 535 interviews. Then we parsed that down even further to go to do 12 on-site visits with churches. And we were not cool enough to make it to the 12, whatever. But this led to 10,000 research hours, 10,000 pages of transcripts, and then what we were, I think, most excited about is that over half of those churches were not predominantly white. And so we don't believe that this is like a representation of the large, like of the white megachurch in North America, right? We actually really believe that this is a diverse sampling of the church at large in the United States. One of the largest studies that we know about of its kind in the last probably 30 to 40 years within the church. And so we embarked on this journey, and what we found, and this is what you at Connect Church with leadership have been walking through, are what are the ways that those churches engaged young people well. And so we found 6 different things that those churches did well. And so you're at the beginning of a series called Growing Together. It's why you flew me in to be a part of this, is to launch this series. And I'm going to talk about one of those core commitments. And it's the core commitment that we call fueling a warm community. So I want to talk about the power of warm relationships and how warm relationships can transform young and older adults, young people and older adults. When we asked young people to describe their church, the majority of young people in our study, when they described their church, responded by saying that it was like family. That it was like family. This is one actual quote from a young person in the study. Is like, they said, "This is life. It's not just church life, it's life. It's hard, it's busy, but we're in it together. We are like a family." And this family idea, the thing that's beautiful about family is that families, even the most healthy families, are not void of conflict. And so conflict is not what tears apart families. Unresolved conflict is what tears apart families, right? Conflict is just a normal, everyday, healthy thing as long as it's dealt with, as long as it's resolved. And so what's beautiful about this right here is that family is made up of healthily walking through conflict, healthily walking together with different generations. You've got moms and or dads, you've got children, you've got grandparents at play, you've got aunts, uncles, you've got cousins, you've got whatever you have in family, it kind of functions in the same way in the church. And part of that, which Jamie mentioned earlier, is this desire to become intergenerational. And so what I've spent the last probably decade of my life studying is studying research on intergenerational ministry. So I've written a couple books on intergenerational ministry. I published a bunch of research on how grandparents shape faith formation in grandchildren, looking at whether or not proximity matters. So I studied about 500 grandchildren and looked at proximity. And so we're deeply passionate about intergenerational ministry within the church. And so I want to read a passage from the book of Luke, at the beginning of Luke, that I think gets to the essence of what's happening here with intergenerational relationships and warmth. And it starts in verse 41. Luke 2, Luke 2, 41 to 47. So what's happening here is that the festival of the Passover is taking place, and we'll read about this in a second, and Jesus is on his way with Mary and Joseph, his parents, to the festival of the Passover. So every year, Jesus' parents, went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover, the festival of the Passover. And when Jesus, was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. So that's a very interesting statement, because 12-year-olds were somehow engaged in what happens in the festival of the Passover. So that's a pretty intriguing concept to me. Now, I know historically, I know contextually and culturally, 12 years old then is different than 12 years old today. I get that. But the point is that they're still 12. So 12 years old might have been viewed as more of an adult then, but not so much today, because we've created something called adolescence in the early 1900s. But the idea is that 12-year-olds customarily were part of the festival of the Passover, the feast of the Passover. So it says, after the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, this is great. I don't know if you've ever caught this. It says, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. What? You had one job, Mary and Joseph, and it is to take care of the Messiah. You have failed miserably. Someone call CPS now. There's parental neglect going on, right? Like, what are you thinking? And so they don't know that Jesus is with them, right? And probably the reason why this has occurred is because men would have likely then traveled with men, women would have likely traveled with women, and children would have traveled interchangeably between the two. And so maybe Mary thought that Jesus is with Joseph, or Joseph thought that Jesus was with Mary, but the point is that Jesus is not with them. I was speaking at a conference, a couple of years ago with a bunch of pastors, and I was talking about this, and this pastor raised his hand, and he was like, it's the only time in history that God went missing. And I was like, yeah, that's really bad heresy, but I laughed really hard. It was really funny, and it was the theology jokes, they got me. And so, anyway, so that's why I'm telling you right now, because I thought it was funny. But it went over better than the nun joke, so just recovering. But anyway, so that Jesus is not with them, and they are unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. And so what probably happened was they got to the camp where they were setting up, and Mary and Joseph met up with each other, and they were probably like, do you have Jesus? And Mary's like, well, no. And then he's like, well, I thought you had Jesus. And Joseph's like, no. And then they had this moment of panic probably, right? And so they don't know what to do, so Jesus isn't with them. So they traveled on for a day. So let's count. That's one day out. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. Day 2. After 3 days, so I don't know if that's 3 total days or 3 in addition to the 2 days, but Jesus is missing for 3 to 5 days. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So I'm going to say something, and it's going to be facetious, okay? I'm going to say something a little sarcastic in just a moment, so brace yourself. Jesus is missing for 3 to 5 days. And when Mary and Joseph finally find him, they do not find him in, this is the sarcastic, facetious part, they don't find Jesus in the youth room playing Xbox, having a pizza party. they find Jesus in the temple courts learning from the adult teachers and leaders of the law. And here's the thing. What's interesting to me is that they don't know it's Jesus. It's not like they're like, all right, we probably should invite him in because the Messiah's here, and we should ask him some questions and learn from him, and they don't have a clue that it's Jesus. It just seems to be that deep centrally into what happened at the temple, young people and older adults could interact with each other and learn from each other. And so when we talk about intergenerational ministry, the way I define intergenerational ministry in the book that I wrote is that an 8-year-old can teach an 18-year-old who can teach an 80-year-old about Jesus, and an 80-year-old can teach an 18-year-old who can teach an 8-year-old about Jesus. That we can learn from people no matter where we are on the age spectrum. Are you with me? Yes. But here's the problem. The problem is that every educational system on the planet is predicated on this idea that older people teach younger people, right? And so what's beautiful about the economy of Jesus here is that Jesus is like multiple times in the New Testament talks about this idea that we can learn what it means to have faith from people who are younger than us. That we can learn from younger people to older people and older people to younger people. Now, the way we teach, the way we learn is different based upon our age. So older adults tend to teach through wisdom or like life experience, through sagely advice, through failures, right? That you tend to teach through all of those things. But younger people tend to teach through what I call innocent whimsy. Like that young people have this whimsical faith that we as older adults tend to just grow out of. Like if we're honest, how many of us used to have a faith and now we have replaced faith with fear? And we're like, well, I don't have the faith that I used to, and how many of us could learn from the faith of a young person? How many of us have learned from someone who's younger than us about what it means to follow Jesus? And so when we talk about intergenerational ministry, when we talk about warmth, what we're talking about is this generational coming together, like this coming together of different generations with different understandings and different backgrounds and different contexts and like cultures, and saying, let's learn from each other. So we have this assessment for churches that we do, and the assessment shows, it kind of scores where is your church currently at with each of the core commitments. And what's really interesting is that a lot of churches will score really high on fueling a warm community. They'll score high on warmth. But the more you dig in, the more you realize that the reason why churches score high on warmth is because everybody knows each other who's been attending the church for the last 30 years. But if you are new and you are trying to get integrated into the church, how warm and welcoming is your church to those younger people who are trying to get integrated? Is it warm because you know everybody already, or is it warm because you're saying, let's figure out how to build relationships intergenerationally? So when we talk about warmth, these are some of the words that we would use. These are some of the descriptors. We would say a warm church is welcoming. A warm church is accepting. A warm church is belonging. You have belonging there. It's authentic. It's hospitable. It's caring. These are some of the words. These are some of the descriptors that young people used when they described what their church was like. It's like a family, but it's also welcoming, accepting, belonging, authentic, hospitable, caring. How would the young people at Connect Church describe Connect Church? Would they describe it like this, or would they say, well, there's a lot of people who already know each other and they're interconnected? Or would they say, there's actually like this deep desire and longing for us to learn and grow from each other? Now, taking this one step further, it's not just that these words are used, but here's the thing, is that warmth is less about how we feel the words are used and more about how young people feel those words are used. So we can say, oh yeah, our church is really, really warm. Our church is really accepting, and it creates a sense of belonging and hospitality and caring. But it's less about what we believe and more about the perception of what young people have toward warmth. Are you tracking with me? One of the most compelling statistics of this entire study, as we studied 1,300 people, did 1,300 interviews, is this statistic in warmth. When we asked everybody this question: why are you involved in your church? Like, what makes you involved in your church? We asked everybody that question, but then we parsed it out to look at 30 and below and how 30-year-olds and below answered, and then we looked at how 31 and up answered. Because we wanted to kind of say, or it was actually 29 and below, sorry. It was 29 and below and then 30 and up. We wanted to know if there was a difference. And so when we asked young people, why are you involved in your church? What we found was this, is that they are not involved in our churches because of programs. 45% of young people, 29 and below, responded by saying, it's because we are in relationships. It's because of the relationships that we're in. And I think we have all sorts of assumptions that we can make about why young people might attend our church. And we might say, well, young people attend the church because of the worship music. And here's what we found. Worship music was mentioned by 12% of those under 29, and only 9% referenced worship style. It just didn't seem to come up. Does it mean that it's not important? I don't know. It just wasn't the thing that came up when we asked, why are you involved in your church? Why do you attend your church? And so the point is that young people have this deep longing and craving for relationships. Here's where it gets interesting. When we asked those who were 30 and up, that number dropped in half. So what we found was that instead of 45% of people saying that they were involved in relationships, it turned into 23%. So 30 and up, 23% were pointing towards relationships, which tells us a few different things. But one of the things that I think it tells us is that young people have this deep, deep desire for relationships. And the older we get, the less we think that they become important for our church. Maybe we point towards programs. Maybe we point towards like listening to a sermon or attending something. But here's the thing. The thing is this, that programs seldom change people, but people often change people. And if I were to ask you, why do you love Jesus? Like for those of you who would identify as a follower of Jesus in here, if I were to say, why do you love Jesus? My assumption is that most of you would be able to point to a person's name. Like an actual individual of someone who deeply, deeply shaped your faith. You wouldn't say, well, it's because I attended a service and I sat in services for 3 years and listening to someone preach. It's just not the case because programs seldom change people, but people often change people. And I think that we know that this is true because of this next statement right here, is that we, is it not going to go? There we go. Is that you can download good preaching, but you can't download thoughtful mentoring. Like here, you preach, I'm assuming, the majority of the time here at Connect Church. You can go download all of his sermons, all of Pastor Nate's sermons. Like, I'm sure they're great sermons. Like, you can go get those right now. You can go get the sermons of the pastors of the largest churches in the United States, all over the world. You can download those, but you cannot download thoughtful mentoring, one-on-one discipleship that is done in warm relationships. There are a bunch of myths that I think we have in the church, and a couple of the myths that I think we have is that in order to reach young people, you need to have some sort of a big budget. You need to have like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go towards young people. Or you need to have some sort of like a contemporary worship service, or what we would say is like an off-the-charts cool quotient, that it just needs to be super, super cool, or that in order to be relevant to young people, you need to like have plugs in your ears and tattoos and wear skinny jeans. And what we're finding is that you just don't need to do those things. You don't have to be hyper cool and try to be culturally relevant. At the end of the day, young people are just desperate for meaningful, deep relationships. And so instead of having some sort of like an off-the-chart cool quotient, what we would actually say is that warm is the new cool. That warm is the new cool. Like that warmth is actually the thing that young people are desiring. That warmth is the thing that they're actually seeking when they come into church. And so what happens is that when we think more about programs than we do relationships, we end up missing the point for young people. And young people are like, I just want to be connected in relationships. There's a blogger whose name is Rachel Held Evans who just recently passed away, tragically passed away young. And she's a pretty controversial blogger, so take that for what it's worth. So if you're familiar with her, but she resonated. She was very prophetic for a lot of young people in the church today. And what she would say, what she said in one of her blogs, is that young people aren't looking for a hipper Christianity. We're looking for a truer Christianity, a more authentic Christianity. No coffee shops or fog machines required. How many of us were like, well, the program is the thing that matters, getting to the service and having this crazy good thing. It's like, one of the things we often say is that churches who demand excellence in their services, and we do want services to be excellent because we don't want it to be distracting and all that stuff, but what we would say is that excellence can actually be the death grip of warmth. There's less theater, more family room. Right? And so what happens in family rooms? You sort through things, you talk through things, controversial things come up, you wrestle with it, and you grow together in family rooms. So less theater, more family room is kind of what we're wrestling through. And so there's this end of this passage that we started with in Acts 20. And I want to read just the last couple of verses here as we continue on, because it's pretty interesting. And so Acts 20, Eutychus has just fallen and he has died. And then in verse 10 it says, Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said. He's alive. Which is crazy because he was raised from the dead, which is like a whole other sermon that I don't have time to get into, and Nate can deal with it. But he raised him from the dead. Don't be alarmed, he said, he's alive. And then here's what I love about the response from the church. The response is, then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, which is crazy, after talking until daylight, he left, and the people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. They take this young man who's experienced this tragedy, they somehow raise him back to life, which is insane, but then they bring him back with them, and they begin building this relationship with Eutychus. And we at the Fuller Youth Institute are so passionate about taking the relationships that we have with young people and walking out. Could you imagine if we, as the church at large, or Connect Church, were known as a church that walked out with young people and were greatly comforted? That Eutychus was greatly comforted. There's this national park in the United States that, I'm sure many of you have heard about. And it's this national park called Death Valley National Park. This is a picture of Death Valley right here. And Ken Robinson, who's an educator, talks about this concept, but he says that Death Valley is one of the most inhospitable places in the entire world. It's just arid, it's desert, it's dry. They get somewhere like 7 to 9 inches of rain a year, and it is scorching hot. I was actually speaking a couple of years ago in Bullhead City, Arizona, and I was speaking at this conference that they had put on, and so I'm sharing this story right here because it's been pretty compelling to me, and so I get to this point where I say, and Death Valley is the hottest place in the world, and 500 people yelled back at me and went, nuh-uh. And it's because earlier that year, Bullhead City, Arizona had just been named the hottest place in the world. And I just happened to be there and said it and got it wrong, and they called me out on it. So Death Valley is one of the hottest places in the world. 124 degrees at one point, scorching hot. Nothing lives there. It is dead. And about a decade ago, during the winter, something freakish happened at Death Valley. And it's happened a couple times since. It happened in 2013 as well. Where during the winter, they got dumped on by a ton of rain. Like 10 inches of rain fell in like a 24-hour period of time. And it was just a bizarre experience that just doesn't really happen. And so the rain goes, it dries up. Death Valley goes back to its regular, everyday, arid, dry, inhospitable landscape until spring. And when spring hits, something very intriguing happens. What happens in spring is that the entire floor of Death Valley was covered in these germinated desert flowers. And all sorts of scientists freak out. Like they're like, what in the world just happened? And so these scientists flock to Death Valley because they know in just a short period of time, Death Valley is going to go back to its dry, deserty, arid, inhospitable landscape. And so they're trying to get to Death Valley before all of this dries up and withers up. So they get to Death Valley, and here's what scientists realized. Scientists realized that Death Valley is actually not dead, it's dormant, and it's waiting for something to wake it up. And for our young people, some of us may think that our young people are just dead. And what we would say is that young people, no, they're not dead. They are dormant, and they are waiting for something to wake it up, and that is Jesus. And Jesus comes, he wakes us up, but here's the challenge within the church. The challenge in the church is that when those young people wake up to who Jesus is and he transforms them, we in the church have to be committed to not letting those young people go dormant again. For us in the church, we need to recognize that there is vitality in young people. There's vitality in older adults. And how can we come together intergenerationally to walk with each other so that our faith never, ever goes dormant? And so one concept with Sticky Faith, with the college project that I had mentioned, and then Growing Young, that's been really, really helpful for us is this idea of what we call developing a new 5-to-1 ratio. So Chap Clark, who's a colleague of ours at Fuller, he's actually a Presbyterian pastor now in Southern California, but he was a researcher for us for about 20 years. He said what we need to do is we need to develop a new 5-to-1 ratio. And so a 5-to-1 ratio, or a ratio for children to students, is very common in like every educational setting or in the church nursery. I'm sure there's ratios where for every 5 maybe children, there's one what? Like adult or a chaperone or a leader or something, a volunteer, something like that, a teacher. And so what Chap Clark says is, maybe we need to develop a new 5-to-1 ratio where instead of for every 5 children you have 1 adult, what would happen if we flipped it and we had 5 adults for every 1 child? What would happen if we could surround our young people with this web of relationships that is meaningful and deep and beautiful and very intergenerational? What would happen with young people if they experienced those kinds of relationships? I was raised in northern Maine. I grew up in northern Maine from 4th grade until I graduated from high school. And while I was there, when I was in middle school, I had a paper route. Anybody have a paper route here? So I had a paper route, and I would deliver these papers, and I would ride the bike for like the 3 weeks a year that it was like not snowing in northern Maine. But I would go deliver these papers, and year round, every single day, I would get up. I would get up at 5 a.m. I would deliver these papers, and in the middle of my paper route was this. Basically like an assisted living facility for seniors who still had the means to live on their own, didn't need to be in like a nursing home or have full care. And it was called Four Seasons Village because there were 4 sections. There was like a summer, spring, winter, fall section. And so there were a bunch of people in Four Seasons Village that were part of my paper route. And so I would deliver these papers, and then I would continue on, and I would go home. So one day, I go, deliver the papers, I go through Four Seasons Village, I get home, and when I walk in the door, there is a message on our answering machine at our house. Do you remember those things? Like a message on your answering machine where it would blink, and like you would hit play on it, and it would play for you. Do you remember this? It was crazy technology, I know. And like that's a thing, like you had a message. And so I look, and there was like a 1, and it was a message. And so I hit play, and it was this woman named Norma. Norma was very elderly. And on the message, Norma says, hi, Matthew, you forgot my newspaper. Now let me tell you something right now. I didn't forget Norma's newspaper. I am positive I didn't forget Norma's newspaper, okay? And so I called Norma back, and she says, hi, Matthew. And I said, Norma, I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about, but I dropped your newspaper off this morning. And she was like, well, but I don't think you did. And I was like, no, I'm positive I did. And she was like, no, but I don't think you did. And so here's what the problem was, that when you miss a newspaper, is that for me, I'm in middle school and I don't have my driver's license. I needed to get my parents to bring me to a local gas station or something, which was called Food Trend. And it was like a mile and a half away. It was inconvenient enough that they had to go do this. The newspapers you had to buy with your own money. It was like 75 cents, which if you've had a paper out is like 8 weeks worth of pay. You know what I'm saying? And so I'm like, I don't have the money to buy a 75-cent newspaper. And so you have to go do that, and then you have to go drop the thing off. It was like an inconvenience that I didn't want to deal with. So I was like, fine. So I'll go get a newspaper. And so I go get this newspaper. My parents bring me, and I go and I walk into Four Seasons Village, and I'm walking up to Norma's house, and who greets me at the door? Norma. Micromanaging Norma. Just trying to make sure that I didn't forget her newspaper. And so I see Norma at the door. She's like over there, and I'm like walking up, and so Norma says, hi, Matthew. And I took the newspaper. I didn't make eye contact with Norma, and I threw it on the ground, and I walked off because I'm a jerk. And I get it. I live in the future now. That was a mean move. I wouldn't do it again, okay? Just letting you know this. But I'm in middle school, and I throw it, and I walk away, and Norma says, she goes, thank you, Matthew. So the day goes on. Next morning, it's 5 a.m. I get up, and I'm getting ready to deliver the newspapers, and I get into Four Seasons Village, and I'm walking up to Norma's house to drop off the newspaper, and who greets me at the door at 5 a.m.? Micromanaging Norma. Making sure I'm like, this is ridiculous. I forgot your newspaper once. You don't need to meet me at the door, right? And so she's like, hi, Matthew. I don't say a word to her. I give the newspaper to her, and I walk off. Next morning, 5 a.m., who's at the door? Micromanaging Norma. 2 weeks in, she roped her husband, George, to meet me at the door. So who's at the door 2 weeks in? 5 in the morning, George and Norma. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is so unnecessary. But they're there, and they're saying hi and stuff. And what was interesting was that over the course of a few months, honestly, I came to appreciate George and Norma. I really did. I came to really appreciate them. They would invite me into their house. We had conversations. And at one point, they made me cookies. And they were like, would you like cookies? And I'm like, probably want cookies to keep up my pear-shaped body, And so, that'd be great to have, And so, of course, and we just talked, and I truly just came to appreciate Norma and George. And so ninth grade, 10th grade or so, I quit my paper out. I quit the paper out. Flash forward until right after I have just graduated from high school. I had been invited that summer to a Christian Bible camp called Riverside Bible Camp in Blaine, Maine. And while I was there, it was the first time I'd ever really done anything like that. I ended up becoming a Christian at Riverside Bible Camp. My whole life, the trajectory of my life just completely changed. And it was this amazing moment and stuff. Well, I'd never stepped foot in a church before, and so when I come back from Riverside, I go to this church called Holton Wesleyan Church, and I walk in the door and I get into the lobby, and who do I see across the lobby? Micromanaging Norma, exactly. Micromanaging Norma. So Norma sees me. Norma lights up. She's got a walker, and she is walking faster than she's walked in years to try to get to me. She's hauling. And so she gets up to me, she looks at me, and as serious as could be, she says, Matthew, I heard that you became a Christian last week at camp. And I said, I did. I was like, I did, Norma. And Norma just starts weeping. She starts sobbing. She starts crying. And I'm standing there, I'm like, what in the world is going on? And then she says to me, she asked this question, she said, Matthew, do you remember the day that you forgot my newspaper? And I looked at her and I was like, I didn't forget. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. I didn't say it. I was like, yeah, I was like, I do. I remember the day I forgot your newspaper. And she said that when I walked away and I'd thrown the newspaper down and I didn't say anything to her, she said she felt like God had said something, just like spoke to her in her soul. And she's Wesleyan, so I don't know that God can speak audibly to a Wesleyan. I'm not entirely sure how that works. I don't know. But she's like, she felt like God spoke something into her soul where she said, you need to wake up at 5 a.m. every single day. You need to greet Matthew at the door, and you need to pray that one day he would come to trust and believe in me. This is God speaking to her. And so she was like, Matt, I want you to know that I woke up at 5 a.m. every single day so that I could greet you and so that I could actually pray for you. And so George and Norma every single day prayed for me. And she said, I want you to know that after you quit your paper route, we still got up every single day at 5 a.m. and we prayed for you that one day you would trust and believe in Jesus. And that day is today. And we can clap for that. When I would go home to Maine to visit family, when I would go home, when I would go back, I would visit 3 people. I would visit my mom and my dad. I would visit my grandparents. My grandfather has subsequently passed away, but my grandmother's still alive. And I would visit George and Norma. This is a picture of me with Norma. George had subsequently passed away by the time we took that picture, and Norma has since subsequently passed away. But I would go home, and I wouldn't go visit my high school friends. I wouldn't go home and visit the people who were the similar age to me. I would go visit my mom and my dad and my grandparents and George and Norma, and I would visit George and Norma. Why? I would visit George and Norma because they loved me in my most unlovable moment. I would go visit George and Norma because they cared for me when I didn't deserve it. I would go visit George and Norma because they showed me warmth and love and care and didn't give up on me when I had failed miserably. And I wonder what would happen if we as a church at large, if Connect Church would be the kind of church where we would deeply, deeply connect with young people who desperately need the love of Jesus, and we would be the love of Jesus to them. What would happen if we as a church became that for young people? What that might mean is that it might mean you wake up at 5 a.m. and you pray for an unlovable young person. What would it take for you to invest in young people? And so I want to end by just asking this question. Just having a moment of reflection. Who is one young person that you can influence today? Who is one young person that you can be a George or a Norma to? Who is one young person that maybe they have failed you and they haven't been right to you, and you think to yourself that they need to make things right before you go build a relationship with them, and instead maybe you just need to say, no, today is the day that I show them the love of Jesus. Today is the day that we build a relationship together. Today is the day I show them warmth. And so, we're going to sing one final song. I have no idea what time it is. What time are we supposed to be done? Yeah. Whoops. You're like, he's not going to be coming back, and it's not because of the tattoos. No. I find that we just get busy in life, and if we don't take time to reflect now, we're just going to go get busy. We're going to go try to figure out what we need to eat. We're going to go watch football. We're going to do whatever we need to do. But if we could just have a moment to reflect and write down maybe the name of a young person who we need to go influence, and do that before we get busy, that can make a world of a difference. And so let's just take a moment of quiet reflection. Maybe we need to shut our eyes. Maybe we need to write down on our bulletins. Let's just take a moment, be quiet, and then I'll pray, and then we'll sing one final song. God, I pray that Connect Church would be filled with hundreds and hundreds of Georges and Normas. That it would be filled with hundreds of young people who are impacted by the Georges and Normas. So God, give the boldness and the courage for each generation to come together, to not dismiss each other because of differences, to not assume things that are unhelpful, but just to love each other, to grow with each other, to learn from each other, and to impact each other. And so God, we love you, but the only reason we love you is because you first loved us. And so thank you for loving us first so that we get to love you back and we get to love others like you love others. And so we pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name, and everybody said,